Really upfront, there is an unnamed element of the DoD that I saw a similar system built in 2018. It never got anywhere because they were trying to make it perfect and it never got there. Different MILDEP, but it's one of those things that definitely kind of keep all of that in mind as you're going forward, that you want to make sure that you understand what is the minimum viable product, what is the minimum bar to get started, because it's a different world and a different technology out there. So here we go. And my partner Annika just left. So
You went to set up Potomac
okay.
for your breakout session.
So I do want to kind of just level set everybody real quick. You're going to hear us talk about Microsoft 365, Office 365, things like Exchange Online. We're going to talk about different products. We're going to talk about technical aspects of it. Microsoft in and of itself has kind of productized things to represent a bundle, right? How you buy stuff. How you buy stuff isn't how you use stuff. So I just wanted to make sure that if we talk about Microsoft 365, you understand it's a bunch of features. But when we talk about Office 365, you're talking about your productivity suite, you're talking about Exchange, SharePoint, Teams. And when you talk about, for example, Exchange Online, you're talking about mailbox and calendaring. When you talk about Teams, you're talking about chat. So we will definitely talk about a lot of that. And I think we all know why we're here, right? Right now, the amount of data that we're seeing generated year over year exceeds exponentially what we're seeing in the environment over and over and over again. So right now, there's more data created in a year than we saw all data that existed 10 years ago. So across that, everything is sort of fragmented and confusing. And with Microsoft, you're dealing with a platform. So when you're dealing with these products, you're not talking about separate stovepipe technologies where nobody ever talks to each other. You're talking about things that are designed to speak to each other and communicate together. So in a lot of ways, you have to rethink from a digital transformation perspective how you're looking at information management, how you're looking at records management, because all this stuff is tied together. I think there was a discussion earlier on, there was a discussion earlier that when you are, for example, sending an email to collaborate on a file, it's not necessarily an attached file anymore. It is a URL link called a modern attachment, and it's actually a link into SharePoint, into OneDrive. So when you're sending that email, when you're sending that collaboration invitation and putting information in the body, you don't have necessarily an attachment. You've got a URL link back to the content. And a lot of what Microsoft is doing on the back end is reassembling that information so you can see what content looked like at the time. So always keep in mind that we have three pillars that everything kind of views on in our vision. One is productivity first. How do we help users do their job, do their work, communicate, collaborate, and discuss things, and still allow compliance, still allow records management, still allow controls on top of that content without making it overly burdensome. So with that, we're also dealing with in place. We want this data. We don't want to, take the old version of journaling data into a separate system. We're in the cloud now. You don't need to journal things off into a separate system because you're not going to have your performance impact that you used to have where you'd take all your data into a separate system and run it separately because you didn't want folks' mailboxes crashing every time you did a search to try and do a FOIA request. So from that perspective, everything is in place. And then, of course, we're doing the suite wide. So all the tools that you are seeing together within the platform are in our design stack to capture this data and preserve it accordingly. And we've seen that since 2014 in terms of chat, phone messages, text messages. All of this litigation happened a really long time ago. And in 2018, when I first came into the federal sector, specific to records management and helping certain agencies come into the cloud, I was kind of like, okay, what are you doing with chat? Oh, we don't keep chat. It's not a record. I'm like, really? I looked at the NARA guidance, and for 4 years now, it's been a requirement to capture this data. Oh, we don't do it. And then when I started meeting with NARA and Lisa, who had to take off today, and general counsel, they're like, it's always been a requirement. I don't know why they're not keeping it. So just know that we put these tools entirely across the suite. And this is not the days of I'm going to put every mailbox on litigation hold, which means I'm going to keep it forever. And then eventually I'm going to try and sort things out on the back end. And that really drives itself to an in-place paradigm shift where you're pulling data out of the environment. It stays where it is, it lives where it's authored, it lives in the inbox that it was in, and then you're assigning controls to it to allow it to be discovered, and then you can go find this information afterwards. So with that, we're looking at built-in, right? Providing you built-in capabilities, providing intelligent capabilities, including things like AI, trainable classifiers. We'll discuss those in a bit. And we want it to be defensible. That is the key behind all of this, is you have to be able to say that we've done our best, that we've defended the processes and the technologies that we put in place to capture this data, and it's being captured according to our intent, not to our regulatory control. One of the things that I often come into is that there's established policy that is based on technology. And that's hopefully what we're going to try and get everybody away from if you're not away from it already. We don't want you designing policies and procedures that are predicated on a specific way a technology works, because technology will change. So when I say built-in records management, here's basically what we're looking at, right? Once again, we're back to that theme. Don't negatively impact the users. Reduce cost, reduce risk. Risk would be, how do you secure to the data? Risk would be, I've got 7 copies of the data elsewhere, and pretty soon that system is going to get compromised, and I'm going to find everything that hasn't been vetted sitting in WikiLeaks and being provided to whomever wants to find it. And also to increase our level of visibility into what's happening so that you can provide the proper oversight. And this gets really interesting for some of you who are in a single tenant kind of environment where you may have multiple organizations that kind of have different rules or different ways of doing things. So if I'm an entire department and I'm individual groups, agencies, whatever, in a single tenant, right? Everybody's doing different things because they've been doing different things since faxes were sent. So how do I provide the proper centralized oversight to ensure that everybody's kind of singing from the same sheet of music when we have deviated over time? And then where it's appropriate, you can get everybody back on the same page, and where it's not, you can set those boundaries accordingly. So be aware from a technical perspective. We're finding data and we're applying metadata, we're applying rules to it. And I think this is an important slide for people to see, because for this audience right now, we're talking about records, but we come crashing into the CUI concept when we get in here, or formerly known as FOUO. So from that perspective, when we start talking about finding content, identifying why that content is important, which includes what exactly is the situation in which it occurs, what is the appropriate association of the meaning of that content. We also run into concepts where we start encrypting and providing security. So you're archiving it, you're retaining it, you're keeping it so that it is maintained for the right period of time. You're able to discover it and produce it, but also you can apply the proper controls on it. So you can say, you know what? Not everybody in the organization needs to read this content, even if it's not an IL6, IL7 system. Maybe I still want to put controls in place and follow that least permissions concept, but the right people at the right time with the right permissions can go in and still identify that content and fulfill their obligation. Usually that means remove the encryption, download it, and send it to NAR. So from all of that, I'm going to talk about 2 things and what's coming, and we're going to hit some roadmap items specific to information governance and records management. And those are 2 different things, but really we should think about them in the same context. We should think about them in the same way, because not everything is a record, but everything's information that should be managed. And then some way, that's how our scope changes. What I have found in organizations that have the biggest challenge of trying to adapt to a cloud world is that they treat those as 2 different things. And information governance is usually done by IT, and records management is done by records managers, and the 2 organizations don't talk. And where I've seen the most success and the quickest success in the federal space is when those 2 organizations start communicating and start working together And in some cases, in customers that I've dealt with, where they actually co-locate. So now you've got records managers sitting in with the exchange team, talking about email and setting up those policies. You have records managers who are responsible for this, that, or the other, sitting in with those teams, helping design that. So while it's great what Flank Speed has done, that is not in place. That is basically taking manual processes and building another system that mirrors manual processes, but people are comfortable with it. So how do we get the technologists together to kind of take that next step? Well, now that they've got Flank Speed, what I would want to see is I would want to see them talking about how to make this better, how to use different tools, how to move away from making copies of everything, and how we tie all this information together in one or more systems. There may not be a single answer to systems depending on what you're using, but there's a lot you can do to make things better. So I do have two pillars that I like to talk about when I go down this roadmap. One, compliance and data governance, your information management. Keep stuff. I want to keep stuff that I want to keep. I want to delete stuff I want to delete. That is that entire side, right? Just keep it, preserve it, or get rid of it. That is what we call a G3 feature, right? That happens just at the base level of the system. How that happens becomes a G5 feature. So I did want to call that out because there was a discussion in the previous session about Flank Speed that they were talking about what they had at the G3 licensing level. Well, that's where you have archiving. You have the ability to apply data labels. You have the ability to do all this. Keep this data, preserve this data. It's all by hand. And as a technologist, not as a Microsoft employee, but as a technologist, I'm going to tell you right now, everybody needs G5. You may not need Microsoft G5. You might need a third-party tool, but at G3, everything is manual. So at that point, you either train people with process and hope that they're 100% compliant, or you build something, or you buy something. That's your options right there to do everything at scale. Now, when we get on the other side of this, where we talk about e-discovery, and it's important for me to use that term e-discovery because that's what we call it in the console. What we're talking about is find and retrieve. The left side is I've kept it, I've retained it. What the heck do I do with it? So e-discovery is the console, and I'll show you some use cases here a little bit later. Console, we're going to find that data, you're going to retrieve that data. It could be as simple as I'm going to run an e-discovery search, I'm going to look for a certain label in a certain time period, I'm going to generate a PST, an Outlook output file, and ship those Exchange files off to NARA. Now, that is a very manual process, but it works. NARA's working on how to get there in an automated manner. The easy button is not there yet. It's being worked on. There's a lot happening there. So from that perspective, you need to understand that. Now, when we talk about this, once again, this automation side, this G5 concept, when we get into e-discovery, now we're talking about all of these different capabilities for things like AI, things like data map. We've gone beyond, we've gone into automation. And how do I automate that search, that context-based search? I once worked on a DoD project called Jailbreak. And some folks that worked on that project retired, started their own restaurant bar. They called it Jailbreak. So now we've got all this email running around our government system. This is, hey, let's go get wings at Jailbreak. And that concept of just doing the search for the term jailbreak, you've now got Project Jailbreak, and you've got how many happy hour emails going around? I can't even imagine. But now you need to contextualize. Where is this content and make that decision about this is relevant to government business. This is about people going to get wings after work. So you got to split that out and then bring those capabilities in. And that's actually, just kind of diatribing for a little bit. That is where you are seeing a lot of focus of different companies out there is how they leverage different capabilities that are going to help you make that intelligent decision based on context. It happens so much so that the former chief software officer of the Air Force left his job, started his own company, and now he's rolling that out and has it tied into what you would call OpenAI, ChatGPT is what we call it from a website perspective. He started his own company that does that. You know, what is CUI? And he's going out using the ChatGPT like service to then do that evaluation. So it's where everybody's going. And he saw that coming about 2-3 years ago and started his own company to do that. So today in the system, you have these options about what you take a look at and how you examine this data and how you look at it. And as you start looking at file types, as you learn about classification methods, all of this drives into a single conversation around identification of content. We have, the number keeps changing, these built-in classification methods. If any of you actually want to get involved with what is CUI conversation with Microsoft, let Megan know. This is actually something our product group's working on, right? They're working on how we do that intelligent classification of CUI, because that is highly contextualized based on your business. What an aircraft manufacturer thinks CUI is very different than what perhaps Department of the Navy, which doesn't have that many, but does have some aircraft, means. So that can get very, very different. So there's a lot that comes into how your environment views that data. So from this perspective, this is how we're classifying things. This is how we're pulling all of this together. So we're looking at location, we're looking at metadata and property, we're pulling in this concept called sensitive information types. And sensitive information types, I'm calling that one out very specifically, is important because we're generating this concept of how different tools within the environment can consume understanding what data is, right? So from that perspective, if I have, if I want to classify something and put it as in and I don't mean make it a classified piece of information, but actually contextualize information that it needs to be encrypted, that it's sensitive enough that it requires encryption, then I'm going to create sensitive information types. If I'm going to identify CUI, PII, HIPAA, all of these different data concepts, we get into sensitive information types, and all of the tools we're building over time are able to consume those definitions. That's how we're able to push this over to the concept of Azure Purview. So understand, Microsoft is going beyond Office 365, and now we're pushing into the IaaS and PaaS environment. Office 365 includes something like file shares. We've had a technology for years now that can go look at file shares, right? And file servers and SMB shares, NFS mounts, and tell you, okay, here's all the files. Well, these are still files. So how do I go into database services, data lake services, blob storage, and start identifying this? So we're setting these sensitive information types, these definitions, in a single place. And then it kind of permeates throughout the system so that you can configure it to identify this. So, we're going to talk a lot about Office 365, M365, your preferred nomenclature, but Microsoft is pulling these rules so that other services can use the same set of definitions. Your DLP services can read the same definitions and go, you know what, not only am I going to put a data retention label on this, I'm going to prevent it from being downloaded. And all of this can kind of tie together into a single platform concept, which can be very difficult when we talk about, historically speaking, these were separated technologies with siloed groups who may not even report to the same SES, who are off in different worlds and don't talk to each other. And now we've given you the tools and the oversight to see this centrally, which CIOs love, but individual groups may not, because now it's a level of collaboration and discussion around configuration that can be pretty stressful to try and pull everything together. And what you're going to see rolling out in commercial right now, which is not in DoD, but is starting to come in, is a concept of SharePoint syntax. So we've taken AI exists in trainable classifiers, right? We have a large language model, reading in data. We've got like a generic, trainable classifier. We're going to have a breakout session on this, but it's like contracts. And then I'm going to provide my own sample in a SharePoint, a SharePoint library that says, I've got this large language model that tells me this is what a contract is. Now I'm going to say, this is what my individual agency's contracts look like as a sample. And you've got that machine learning aspect that comes into play, that now it has a sample to narrow down, this is what the internet says a contract looks like versus this is what my individual tenant says a contract looks like. And I think we've had this rolled out in the DoD cloud since 2020. So it's kind of funny. We've got all this ChatGPT AI discussion now. It's like, yeah, we rolled that out a long time ago. But from that perspective, from a context-based perspective, it's the world's fastest autocomplete. And what we're doing is we're augmenting that inside your tenant boundary, what's happening there, to then, of course, add your own data, retaining all those kind of foundational pieces inside your tenant so that you're not sharing that, you're not feeding the model, and providing you context back. Document understanding is kind of the next kind of version and vision of this. This is out of the SharePoint group. So if you hear all the old names of Microsoft SharePoint, they're out there building the concept of document understanding and taking this analysis to the next level. So there are some interesting things with trainable classifiers, but in that sense, it's not the end all be all. It was an early AI model. Now we're kind of moving this on to the next level, and that's something that's out in preview commercial today. So it's very interesting how they're drawing these almost like synapse-based conclusions between documents to allow you to contextually identify what content is what. What is a record? What does that mean? And then building that neural model to figure it out. And then after that, you start assigning policies. So all this kind of tells you where you are associated with that content. And one thing that I did want to call out here is we have this 17A4 concept, but we really get into what is this is important for some DoD customers who really like this feature, some don't. But now we're talking about kind of the automation of that concept. I'm old enough that I remember when you used to break the little tab on the floppy disk. It's to break the tab on the floppy disk. This is a CDR concept for those who are a little bit younger, but still as old as I am. So it's that write once and then make it immutable at that point, as opposed to you can make records living and you can snapshot them. You have this pretty elaborate concept that you can get into about versioning and what constitutes a record in versioning and when does it become a record. So we do have some of that immutable capability where everything locks down immediately, that you don't have to institute through. So also circling back on the retrieval, just once again, we're going to discover, preserve, collect, process, cull. We've got that kind of pull through here, and using a machine learning model to kind of drive that forward. So what's coming? What's happening? What are we talking about? So who knows how we preserve messaging in Teams? Who knows where? Anybody know where?
Your email?
It's in your email. That's right. So what we do right now is we create that immutable copy out of the communication substrate. Oh, thank you. And we shove it in your mailbox. Long story short, little inside baseball for you. Everything we do in this environment is either shoving it in a mailbox and using mailbox rules, or shoving it in SharePoint OneDrive and using SharePoint OneDrive rules. Pretty much what we do. Well, now we're giving users in chat the ability to interact with that labeling. So instead of communicating, basically doing things behind the scenes and applying the rules on the mailbox behind the scenes, you can actually let users interact with it going forward. This is very important for people who are still relying on the user to manually classify data. I don't know that that's where you individually want to be, but there was enough demand and enough concern about it that we got a lot of people who said, I still want my users to make that call. Guides, that's always been a big concern. Good thing to read. We've rolled out guides now to let you know how to do things and our perception associated with them. We had a lot of technical documentation, not a whole lot of guides. Wanted to bring this one up. I'm not going to necessarily say that I will ever see Teams truly roll out as a true, replacement to a phone system in the DoD, but you can have voice calls in Teams. Well, now those call data records can now be captured as retention. Now, this is once again GA and commercial, which means we're going to see this coming later in the year. It's still got to go through all the FedRAMP checks, right? So when we release something in commercial and GA, it hasn't been through all the FedRAMP accreditation, so there's still a lag. 3PAO audit types of things. So this is coming. But the intent here is to really let you know this is what Microsoft's thinking about, and this is where we're going.
So is this recording like the messages that would be in a chat from a meeting, or is this actual like what people are saying? Like,
This is call records. So you can actually do all that other stuff already. So we actually have translation services if you want to capture translation. We have the ability to capture video calls if you want to do that. All the recording aspects of it are actually video parts of it are what we call stream, and you can translation actually produces hard copy. But that basically what that data is doing is giving you that SharePoint like kind of functionality where you're creating that copy and then assigning that same retention metadata to it. This is about the call records showing ins and outs.
And also in Teams, in preview right now, there's a new technology that does auto summarization of like the Teams thing. So like this whole session, it does the transcript. You can search by who said what and stuff like that for custodians or capstone purposes, but it will generate a summary of the conversation so that you can use that for records management classification pieces as well.
oh, wow.
And that was actually hilarious. I was having a conversation with Lisa Haralampis from NARA about that before we left. That feature right now is a huge, of huge interest because it's gone away from what is exactly was said as and has moved to that summarization concept helps you understand from a higher level the meaning and intent, and has gone away from what did they say, but also what did they say and what did they mean.
So I don't have to write notes anymore.
In theory,
It's actually.
Yeah,
very
it's
accurate.
spooky how accurate it is. It's, I mean, we've got it rolled out inside Microsoft, and it will give you
Oh, yeah.
a fantastic summation of what's going on, and it'll also capture the action items, like who committed to do what in the meeting. You're like, oh, did I actually say I was gonna?
yeah, our project manager.
Accountability is coming for everybody. Yeah.
Step further, you can build bots inside there. So if you're in a meeting and say, hey, go schedule this meeting for such and such, the bots can figure those things out and go do those things behind the scenes and stuff for you.
And this is, I just want to plug Copilot real quick, because this is not a Copilot session, but if you have not watched the public demo for M365 Copilot, it becomes very relevant when you're talking about meeting notes, because it can prompt you to remind you, like, this thing that you're looking for over here was relevant at this meeting over here, and prompt you to include that in response or whatever you might be crafting.
And
Wow.
I want to be very careful when we talk about Copilot. I'm gonna have to say some things about Copilot here. I wasn't intending to, but I will anyway. So I was having a discussion with a gentleman named Ian Leatherman who works at Microsoft, who used to be part of DoD, and we were talking about the compliance associated with OpenAI, right? And this we have an Azure service, right? For those who don't know, OpenAI only exists because Microsoft invented a bunch of hardware that works really, really well to make it possible. And it's an architecture of GPUs, and anybody who knows Mark Rusinovich has a great YouTube video explaining how they invented this hardware. That is an IL2 service from a compliance perspective. And when you talk about this grounding of searches, a lot of what happens in DoD or GCC High, these Office 365 environments, can't leave traces in IL2 environments. So you have people like Ask Sage. The Air Force has done a lot of stuff with GitHub. For those who haven't seen, they have a GitHub architecture where they have IL4 talking to IL2. There's a lot of compliance discussions that have to happen on the DoD side before that stuff is truly adopted. In the meantime, we are still working on making this product the best that it can be in commercial before it ends up as a government service. So just be aware, this is all, when you get into the Copilot discussions, it's great intellectual discussion. We do not have an IL4 service for this. I do not have a roadmap or timeline for an IL4 service. And while there is an IL4 talking to IL2 solution that you can do through networking, that doesn't mean it's going to be compliant at all. And I don't know that any security office right now would have anything but an emotional meltdown if you tried to tell them you had IL4 talking IL2.
And I just wanted to add, some of the features that is being discussed is actually Microsoft Teams Premium as well. So there's many advantages you get with Microsoft Teams Premium versus Copilot.
Yeah, and
Two work together very well.
yeah, there's a lot of stuff happening in Teams Premium and kind of these additional services, but some of the stuff is out there too. You know, right now I would say the AI that we have out there, don't get me wrong, it's very good. But the AI models that we're seeing come out now, come out that are not yet IL4 are better. You know, if you're talking about AI is just basically the best autocomplete that ever existed, the number of books that some of these newer models have read to come to that conclusion versus the number of books that are in the system now have significantly advanced. And that's the best analogy I can think, because the amount of data that they fed these models is significantly higher in the newer models. And some of what we have in GCC High, Azure Cognitive Services in Azure, we actually have a thing that's been in GCC High for 4 years where we fed all of the Kennedy assassination information in there and actually drew a lot of conclusions about the testimony, the handwritten documents. I did a proposal for a department who wanted to declassify information, and we showed them what that would look like if they took this FOUO information and they read it in and drew conclusions and were able to basically publish it publicly as opposed to having it FOUO. There's a lot of services out there and they've been there. So
I have a question. Even though this is Microsoft centric, team centric specifically, right?
Mhm.
But what are the implications of this when we start talking about call reporting, right? As a service, there are various other platforms, there's various other technologies, there's even cell phones, right?
Mhm.
If by policy design, do you see the policy to be encompassing all communication technologies to capture and retain records for?
So spoiler alert for the breakout session. I'm gonna have 2 answers for you.
Yeah.
Paper, honestly, I don't care about paper. You convert it into a digital format and put it in some sort of digital environment. Okay, we can revisit that discussion. I'm not going to create something. Microsoft Collective, the Royal Microsoft, is not creating anything right now that's interested in paper. But for other technologies, we actually have connectors built in, some of which are there. So I can talk about, for example, in GCC today, there's telemessage. Telemessage is how you take text messages off a government device, shove them in a mailbox. Now you're subject to the same kind of things happening in the mailbox. Twitter, got a Twitter connector, not in DoD yet. There's a whole discussion we have about connectors later. Now you can start capturing departmental agency level tweets, shove them in a mailbox. And then they're subject to those same rules of the mailbox across all technologies. The connector list I will show you will blow your mind. Right. And some of it's financial. Bloomberg. I don't think anybody in here cares about Bloomberg. Everybody here cares about Facebook, Twitter, those types of social media platforms and how you're interacting with them, whether that be at an individual, you know, at the MilDep level, at individual unit levels. Everybody has a Twitter account these days from, you know, here on down. So you can tie those into mailboxes and you can wrap controls around them. What you're doing, though, is making an immutable copy. So what you're doing is capturing at time of authorship, right? They can go back and delete tweets, but you've made a copy and shoved it in the mailbox, which makes it discoverable, FOIA-able, and they can't mess with the copy. So they can delete the publicly facing part, but the properly permissioned user can use that e-discovery tool and still find it and pull it. So you've met your due diligence and your defensibility for being able to provide it. Just because I go to twitter.com and it's gone, that's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to be able to preserve it. And you can do that.
Ooh, I'm gonna need a drink.
Okay. Another thing that's come out, and we saw some of this in the previous, is we've gotten a lot of discussion about multi-stage retention. So Microsoft is relying on this capability that when you preserve, right, you've got one preservation. And if you have multiple rules that apply, it'll do an order of operations and figure out which one takes effect. So from that perspective, being able to go through a process and change the label as part of just an automated flow is what we've done at this. So at the end of a certain retention period, you can basically change the label. So perhaps I had to keep something for 7 years. And then at the end of this, I need to identify it and then move it to a 10-year disposition because of some other corresponding thing. You have these concepts that come in place. So there's actually numerous applications, but driving that workflow is kind of what we're building into the tool. And that is another example of something that you see in that kind of G3 versus G5 is what is this automation? What does this workflow look like? What is this review? Otherwise, you're just sitting there pulling down tags item by item, right? This gets into how do you make the accountable folks go through, basically your records managers, go through a workflow and evaluate and determine what to do with swaths of content without having to put everything in a SharePoint library. We doing on time?
You have till 2:30 and then we have a break. So you have,
Okay.
this is my longest session of today.
Okay. Another thing we've done here, cloud attachments. So we've had this e-discovery concept. If I send you a file to collaborate on, right? I'm not sending you a file, I'm sending you a URL link and you're editing that file. Well, all those copies are sitting in SharePoint, right? So I've got 27 versions of a document. So that concept of point in time recreation, not what does the file look like now? Not what does version 7 look like, but on this date, when this email happened, what does it look like? That's what we've kind of to move in here is I don't want to retain the entire document. I don't want to retain the 27 versions. I don't want to have an official process. This is actually something that is in Flying Speed, that is in some of the other systems that I've seen built in the DoD, is that I need somebody of a certain rank to click a button and then it becomes a record. So I want to move away from that. I have to have someone do something to make it a record and now let some sort of automated process make that determination. And this is kind of some of the underlying engineering behind that allows you to say, you know what, I got 27 versions of a file, but it's this one right here at this date time is the one that I need to capture and preserve under a certain retention record and not the rest of them. Capstone applicability has been discussed a lot about this, but we're just going kind of round and round in circles about what does it mean to be capstone and really what does it have, if I'm editing a file and I'm a capstone official that 20 other people have edited, are only my edits applicable? That's kind of getting into the concept of what we're doing here and why actually, it was interesting, Lisa brought up threading. We actually have extended this to attachments, but this came from something that's already out there, which is the ability to recreate a chat thread, right? So we're saving all those chats and you have those context. And that's what we're expecting Nara to really comment on further, is that it's not about keeping a capstone official's chats. It's about keeping all those chats in a conversation thread and then being able to recreate that conversation thread. And we do that conversation thread recreation in the e-discovery retrieval now. Finally, of interest on this side, simulation mode. What does it look like? What's the impact? If I roll this out here, did I just make my entire environment subject to 15-year retention? So now you can actually start running these simulation modes and figuring out what the impact is to an environment. There oftentimes tends to be this concept that I've moved to the cloud and I'm just going to bring everything with me, right? I'm going to have a lot of this garbage that comes with me. So if I'm building these rules, this helps me kind of sort that out. But it doesn't have to be that. This is just really, talking about impact and simulating impact before applying something to the environment. A lot of other stuff that's coming here. One thing I do want to break out and call note is we have something here called the scope of administration of retention and retention label policies coming to the Gov Cloud in August of 2023. That's coming this August. It's out right now in commercial and preview, and it's going GA in June, I believe. We have had this pushback for a really long time. And when I used to have this conversation years ago, it was more about how do you consolidate and how do you push back? And there's just so much in the marketplace in general, not just the government, fragmentation of policies and who manages what. So this concept of administrative units is the term for it. And these links, by the way, to the public roadmap will be provided. Administrative units are this concept that I can take groupings of my organization and put them under the ownership and administration of a group of individuals, but they can't touch the rest of the tenant. So from a DISA perspective, this was like DISA wanting to say, you know what, I don't want to manage retention for your email. I'm going to give this to everybody who comes in our environment. From from a MilDep perspective, it's they don't want the entire, Army, the entire Navy, the entire Air Force trying to create these centralized rules and apply them to the organizations. They want to farm out creation of those rules down to a lower administrative level. But when those people create the rules, you don't want them to impact everybody. So I can, for example, if I have a department and I go down to the agency level, I'm going to put people in charge of creating the rules per agency. And I'm going to define what each agency grouping is, right? What SharePoint sites do they own? What mailboxes do they own? What content do they own? When they create rules, they can only touch their people, can't touch anybody else. Compliance boundaries, which you heard about in the previous discussion, which has been out for a while, is that retrieval concept. I only want to be able to retrieve content that I'm permission to look at. I'm doing FOIA requests for agency X. I don't want agency Y and agency Z's results. I'm not even allowed to look at them. When I run my FOIA request, I'm only seeing the content that I'm administratively encircling. So this is a huge part of the story, just because a lot of people have asked for this, that they want to farm, they don't want one group creating rules and saying, I created a rule for just this agency. I created a rule for just this agency. They want to push down that rule creation and that retrieval to the end sources. Also, from that perspective, that was a big one of note. I think there's some legacy information on here that's a lot longer discussion for some, but there are, for those of you who have legacy exchange policies, there's a discussion on how to move away from just writing rules that affect email and a platform level rule that affects chat, that affects everything else. Wanted to bring this one up as we move into this. Power Automate has become kind of our citizen developer tool to build workflows without being a developer. So more and more you're seeing Microsoft building this kind of workflow engine. For those who know SharePoint, think of like SharePoint Designer became this thing that just didn't affect SharePoint anymore. Power Automate is kind of that automation engine behind it. So more and more you can build these rules that run, and you can start basically citizen developer writing those rules. So we're moving away from having to have a professional who can write queries, who can write code, who can do this tool, and moving it towards somebody really sharp who's taken a couple YouTube video classes and now they can start generating their own stuff. Finally, I wanted to move into the e-discovery piece so you can understand where that's going. E-discovery, once again, for you, is about retrieval. We call it e-discovery. It's about data, finding data and doing something with it. And that includes downloading it and shipping it to Nara. So from that perspective, we have these context things called cases. So everything works in a security boundary, and you assign people these security boundaries. So as they do searches, you're building these security boundaries, and we're now moving so that you have more capability to kind of migrate from this initial kind of keyword, find me the label, find me the content kind of stuff, find me all the this individual's email, and being able to move it into that context-based. So eDiscovery Standard is what we call the G3 tool. eDiscovery Premium is what we call the G5 tool that starts using AI and machine learning and all this additional vetting. We started talking about additional OCR, all these different capabilities. So we're now moving in this kind of capability where you can start looking at content very quickly in your basic standard searches. And then instead of having to recreate the wheel as you start doing context-based AI assisted, machine learning assisted kind of capabilities, you can just move them over automatically. Also, collect export is your dump and run concept. So I just want to take it, produce an output. I don't even want to look at the content. I just want to create an output based on some sort of finding or query. Then, of course, we have some additional things going on. Expanded to support, a good one to point out here is items in the recycle bin. The entire concept of what we're doing here is we're trying to, the content doesn't go to the recycle bin, right? We're stopping it. With retention labels, we're stopping it from going to the recycle bin. We're proactively identifying and keeping it out of there. So if you have content that does end up in the recycle bin, we do have some capabilities to keep it there. I like to bring this one up because, I don't know, even as recently as 2022, I have conversations with people who try and manage records out of a recycle bin. It drives me crazy because the Exchange product, that on-prem server product, and then later moved to the cloud, was never designed around keeping immutability inside of a recycle bin. So now we're kind of putting the brakes on some of that cleanup, and that allows you to have some additional preservation come into play in case you have different types of activities that occur. If they somehow end up in the recycle bin. But I love to bring that one up just because that concept of recycle bin, whole concept of preservation is don't put it in the recycle bin. Keep it somewhere in the system, even if the user can't see it. Even if the user doesn't know it's there, even if they're searching their mailbox and they can't find it, a super user, a privileged user can do that search and find that content. So I decided to add the slide here at the end to give a good concept for government. When we talk about e-discovery, that's what we call the tool. That's what it looks like in the environment. But it is a search retrieval tool. So just so when you're talking about this e-discovery, you don't think about just legal. You think about everybody that's actually searching for content. So once that information is preserved, once that information is saved in place, 7 years, 10 years, 15 years, event driven, 7 years from retirement, whatever kind of trigger you want to put into place. Remember, these are the people who are actually taking a look at it. And it becomes really interesting. I've never seen this on the DoD side, but I actually have an interesting side note on this. When Teams first came out, I sat with an organization, federal organization, and we talked about Teams and how to preserve chat and how to preserve all this, and also talked about forced deletion. Records managers were like, well, we preserve everything, we keep it for this long. And then the chief privacy officer got up and started yelling at the records managers, stating that was a violation of privacy laws that have existed for federal employees since the 70s. And I watched two lawyers yell at each other for 20 minutes while I'm trying to do a technical demo of how to do a video chat. So from that perspective, it's good context. It's kind of a funny anecdote to give good context that everybody's coming together and doing these is kind of looking at the same data. One copy of the data, everybody's looking at it. Everybody's putting rules into place and making sure you have through governance structure that results in configuration that allows you to take all of these kind of different perspectives together so that you're making the right decision for your content. Because I'm not going to, it's not my job to create policy, right? You tell me the policy, I'll tell you how to configure it. But from that perspective, you'll have different aspects of why we keep information. And it's not just, or why we delete information. And all of that stuff comes together. Now, if you have conflicting rules, we preserve ahead of delete. That's our standardized perspective. But if you start talking about data spillage, right, this becomes a whole discussion. Because if I've just put classified information in an IL5 system and I have retention on it, I've got to do something about that. So now I've got to remove retention on that object and clean it up. So that's something I think we all agree you don't want to preserve data spill. for system, information that's in the wrong impact level. So from that perspective, it's very good to just kind of give everybody that context of a lot of different stakeholders involved, a lot of different people. But please, as a technologist, please don't let perfect be the enemy of good in starting this journey. Because back to that funny anecdote I said earlier, two of these different groups were yelling at each other about whether content should be kept or deleted. And I can tell you how to do either, but maybe it sure beats putting everybody on a 15-year, all content everywhere, all mailboxes on a 15-year litigation hold, never again to be revisited. So I did provide a link in the back because we talk about trainable classifiers. We talk about AI. I did provide the link in here to responsible AI principles. There's a whole, context of where is information that it's kept within your tenant boundary, that the only people that can see the data are your administrators and your own people. Microsoft can't see the data. All of that is part of the principle that's here. But just because everybody literally comes up and talks to me about ChatGPT, we've been including AI in our products for a really long time. ChatGPT is just a better model than we've seen universally because of the amount of content that it's fed. But there's other things out there. So I did provide all that in, as links that are there as well.
We have questions? Any questions for Mike? I have one.
It's demo of that notes capability at some point.
Sure.
Can you talk at all about, I know you're going to go into your next session, but for those who may not, SMS collection for DoD, what that might look like, particularly with, I know there's a lot of controversy around January 6th and that SMS collection that did or did not take place, or whatever the case may have been.
You want me to pull up an architectural link? What is the ask? I can probably just pull up telemessage.
So I know we have two very important people with regard to the process of that in the room. I know we were looking for customers to volunteer or opt into that collection from a third-party data connector perspective. Are we allowed to speak to like where we are with that, or if there's authorization occurring for that?
You mean on the DoD side?
Yeah.
I honestly, Matt, I haven't been paying attention to where we are in the accreditation of that. I just know it's going through the wheels of.
Not a problem on that. So the short answer to this from the Microsoft perspective for non-Microsoft data, what Michael's showing you here on the screen, we are working with third parties to collect that data up and then allow you to essentially stuff it into Office 365 so you capitalize on all the work that you've already done. So do the work once in terms of what are you going to retain, how are you going to process it, how are you going to dispose of that, and then bring the data into the system. So from an SMS, or text message perspective, that's through a third party. Telemessage, is one. Oh God, help me.
Here's the WhatsApp connector that uses telemessage.
So the net on this is you're going to work with whoever your mobile provider or providers are in that third party to hoover the data up. We have a connector that works with these third party solutions to bring that data into Office 365 and then allows you to then put it in the right person's mailbox so that you then have that level of accountability and processing over the data. So
AT&T looks exactly like telemessage.
So I have a question about
Yep.
that, especially with the connect, you talked about WhatsApp, and there's other apps that have encryption built into them.
Correct.
So how does that work?
So that is not in our wheelhouse to change that. That is the provider and the folks that are collecting it have to remove that encryption before you send it in. Sending encrypted data into Office 365 and trying to do something with this just,
Right.
it, doesn't make any sense to start with. So again, that's our part of this puzzle is the records management, the retention, the processing, archiving, and reasoning over that data.
We read
It
it,
is-
it's up to us.
Well, in our linkage to that is the connector.
Right.
So the connectors exist right now in all of our commercial environments. They exist in our government environments right now. They're not GA or generally available. They're not publicly released at this point. All the engineering work is done. What Megan was talking about is we want to make sure that we work with somebody from the government. We have a couple of different, government agencies that are on the beginning stages of doing this before we flip the bits and turn it on universally, just to prove that out. But again, our point on this is, and it's exactly sort of the January 6th bit. Like, what do you mean you didn't collect the text messages? Like, where are they? This allows you to do it, and it allows you to leverage the investment that you've already made in your structure, your process, all of your labels, your schedules, all the rest of that comes in.
Just,
So if
Well,
you're,
very good question.
just a quick follow-up to this. So would you have to have like a mobile device management system, like a sandbox for this? Would it just be the application management? Like, how would we be able to get?
So this is where, again, you'll see, I mean, we can send you the information on it. So you've got Cell Trust is one of the companies, Telemessage is another company. I mean, their entire business is working with the mobile providers to collect all of that data up and stage it so that it can actually
You
come
basically
into
register
Office
for
365 or a third-party solution.
Yeah, but it still has to be an MDM company-owned device, no? It cannot be-
Correct. I mean, there is a level, yeah, you have to have some level of control of the device to collect this. So it's not magic that like, hey, my personal cell phone that's got no
Right.
management on it, all of a sudden, somebody's gonna collect that data.
And-
So you're absolutely correct. I mean, there is a level, again, that you have to have visibility into that to start with. Because there's like, again, there's no expectation that if I'm at home on my own PC, on my own time, sending text messages that somehow that's supposed to
But-
wind up in my work system.
Every government furnished equipment from
Yeah.
a mobile device perspective is leveraging
Yeah.
some
Has
MDM
to.
provider. So,
Can't imagine what would be.
yeah.
and telemessage here is basically, this is an app and a service, right? That's on that phone. So it's got to get there somehow.
Yeah.
So at that point, you're talking about an MDM. We're providing a connector where you can just basically map all that data into a mailbox. So from that perspective, How-
Into the appropriate user's mailbox is the
Fair,
real key there.
yes,
It's not
yes.
just a pipeline to dump it into a big dumping ground.
no, this
It's,
is.
I know
individual.
it's Michael's text message, I know it's Matt's text message, we can put all that together. So if indeed I'm the capstone official and you've got different rules on me that you would have then on Michael, you've already done all that work once and you're gonna leverage that investment. But you gotta get it in. That's the big piece of this.
And that's where we partnered with other services. So the same thing can be said for WhatsApp.
Yep.
Now, there are ethical and policy questions about whether you could put an app on a phone that you don't have MDM over, right? Like that's not a technical hurdle. Technically, you could do it. But at that point, that app has some sort of control over elements of that device, which is a whole nother discussion about BYOD and what kind of level of control do you have of BYOD. So that tends to shift towards a policy discussion, not a technology discussion. But yeah, to that point, it goes to the appropriate individual user mailbox. And the rules that are in place can be extended. That boundary can be extended, or they could be actually split if you want to do that. But my interpretation as a technologist, my interpretation of what NARA is saying is they do not treat email, text, voice messages, any of that communication any differently. The medium doesn't matter. It's the content and the context of the information being shared. The same way that when I started in this business, people wouldn't accept faxes as a record. Faxes weren't a record. It had to have an ink signature on it. And that obviously died very quickly. Same with the rest of this. I'm sure there are RFPs that have been decided over text, and that information probably needs to be captured appropriate to any sort of RFP type scenario, for example. Other questions?
Great stuff.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, so we're gonna take 2:30 to 2:45. When you return, there's 2 breakout sessions for the afternoon. I put them in the chat. I'll pop it in the chat really quickly again. First is for those of you who are maybe knowledge managers or actually are have responsibilities aligned with securing content. There's a follow-on session that Dan from Epic is going to provide with regard to leveraging your M365 Purview investment for, thanks, leveraging your M365 Purview investment for data security in addition to data governance. Most of the work when you get to the point where you've applied labels is like already done. So why not apply some DLP policies to your data on top of your retention schedules? The second track is going to be records management and data lifecycle management beyond M365. So we're talking your Azure assets, non-Azure assets. There's data connectors to Google Cloud, AWS instance, on-prem, etc., and third-party data connectors. And that is going to be in Potomac Conference Room, right over by the 14th floor kitchenette, kind of over in that direction. So at 2:45, if you want to come back here, it'll be leveraging Purview for Microsoft Information Protection. And then in Potomac will be records management beyond.
And we're gonna
65.
We're gonna demo trainable classifiers as well. So.
Yeah.
You know,
For those who are virtual, if you want to do the MIP session with Dan, just stay on this line. If you want to join Mike's session, then I'll put the link to that meeting invite in the chat.
And I'll say this and get in trouble for it, but I'll say it anyway. For Dan's session, when you think MIP, think CUI. Really, that is the most common use case we get out of that information classification is adherence to an RSCUI effort. So starting with visual markings and controls on content.
Yes. MIP is CUI, yes. And for those who want to watch both, Mike is going to make sure that that other session is recorded and share that with me. I'll share it to this group. And then this session will also be recorded. So don't feel like you have to choose. You only have to choose today.
I will